Hi, freshmen. I think it's probably Wednesday morning, and I am either in or on my way to Iowa. Over the next couple days while I'm gone, we're going to use a little video in order to help us keep moving forward in class and look at a couple things left in the life of Abraham. So together with what I'm doing with you here in the video and what Mrs. Bytework will be doing with you in class, we'll be able to learn and keep understanding some things about Abraham. In particular, we've got a couple things to look at to finish this unit related to Isaac. Isaac is Abraham and Sarah's only son, and in Genesis 22, God's going to actually tell Abraham to go kill that son. And so we're going to look at that today, and tomorrow we'll look at how Isaac is married and how Abraham finds a wife for him, and talk a little bit about where Rebecca comes into the picture. But for today, we're going to look at Genesis 22. So hopefully you have that open in your Bibles. If you don't, why don't you get that open? And you should have a handout in front of you, Genesis 22 through 25, the rest of Abraham. Why don't we have, at this point, why don't we have Mrs. Bytework pause this video, and together, out loud, why don't you read Genesis 25, verse 1 through 8. So Mrs. Bytework, you can pause the video and read those verses together. All right, I think we're back, if she paused properly. So here's the setting for the story, right? Think about that. God calls Abraham, and he says to Abraham, I need you to take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there. First of all, Mount Moriah. That's the second question on your handout. Where did Abraham go to sacrifice Isaac? Mount Moriah. We've talked about Mount Moriah a little bit on the first day quiz. Some of you might remember that. You might even be thinking about it right now. If you can't remember where Mount Moriah is, this is Mount Moriah today. Mount Moriah is in the city of Jerusalem, and the area within the walls that you can see is called the Temple Mount. And so what else happened on Mount Moriah? Well, so many things, actually. The first thing that's recorded there is Abraham going to sacrifice Isaac. But later that same place will be bought by David, and later Solomon will build the temple on top of Mount Moriah. So pretty much anything that happened in the temple happened there, whether it's Solomon building it, or Herod building it, or Jesus going and clearing the temple, or the disciples visiting that, or Paul visiting the temple. So much in the Bible actually happened on the hill of Mount Moriah. It's hard to see what Mount Moriah looks like today, because today it's built up around Jerusalem, and that gold dome that that sits on top of it is called the Dome of the Rock. Some of you might have studied that in world history. It's the third holiest site in Islam today. It's where Muslims believe that Muhammad ascended to heaven as part of his night journey. And so it's really sacred, not just to Jews, but also to Christians and to Muslims, for the significance of it. In fact, there's some legend within Judaism, probably not really kind of true, but Judaism likes to teach that really this spot under that gold dome, the place of Mount Moriah, is the center of the entire universe, and that perhaps it's from there that God created the entire universe. That's probably hard to quantify because there was nothing there when God created. But you get the idea. It's really important. So if you need to pause it and jot a couple things down about Mount Moriah and what else happened there on the handout, you can do that. When we come back to the slide, again, it's hard to see what Mount Moriah looks like today. It's not a huge mountain. It's got city built up around it. It would have looked something like this. You can see the location of the Temple Mount kind of sticking out on a spur that almost juts down from the hill. It's not a big hill. Here's looking at Mount Moriah from the southern end as well. Again, tough to pick out the mountain. It doesn't dominate the landscape. It's probably right under that gold dome where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac, because that's the highest point of the hill. And altars and places of worship would have always been at the highest point of each particular hill. If you were to cut away around the Mount Moriah, around the platform that's there, the walls that are there, you would still see a hill underneath, but again, that's hard to find. If you ever are able to go into the gold dome, which I try to do and haven't been able to do yet, mostly because I'm not quite Muslim enough, you would see a place where they think the place where Abraham sacrificed Isaac was sort of carved out still in the rocky face that's under the Goldon. But the other thing that's, I think, worth pointing out, I'm just going to go back to our title slide for a few minutes. When you look at what God says to Abraham, God says, take your son, your only son, and basically go kill him. And we're probably somewhat familiar with this story, but, I mean, think about that for a minute. God had promised Isaac to Abraham and Sarah many, many years ago. God had stepped in blood as part of the covenant in order to ensure the promise that someday Isaac would be born. And he gone to great lengths to say to Abraham and Sarah, all these descendants and promises are coming through Isaac. And then God says in Genesis 22 to them, go kill him. And what strikes me about that, not only is it somewhat confusing that God would say, go kill this son, but notice Abraham's response. I mean, this is the same Abraham who, when God said, I'm going to give you kids, said, really, prove it to me. It's the same Abraham who, when God said, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he said, really? Well, let's negotiate this a little bit. And so I would almost expect Abraham, when God says, go kill your son, I'd almost expect him to be like, really? Are you sure you want me to kill my son? But he doesn't. It actually says that he just gets up the next morning and goes. And I wonder why. And there's different ways of thinking about this. But one thing that I find interesting in thinking about this story is, Abraham is still being introduced to God. We've mentioned this before. There's not a lot of the Old Testament that's been written so far. And so if Abraham's still being introduced to God, he might have some different ideas about what God might really be like, and maybe they're not always true. Abraham lives in a culture where he's surrounded by other people that are all worshiping different types of gods. And the way that the ancient people thought about God and understood God, or God's lowercase g, was that the gods were a little bit more like us, a little more human-like, and a little bit temperamental. Like you had to keep the gods happy in order to get benefits from them. And so, if there's a god of vineyards, then you got to make sure that god of the vineyards is kept happy and satisfied, or else your vineyards might not grow and flourish. Or if there's a god of fertility, you might do things to make sure that god is pleased, so that way your crops and your families could continue to be fertile. And if you weren't experiencing those kind of things, then something's wrong, and you must not have pleased the gods. And so it kind of happens around Abraham in the culture over many, many thousands of years probably. People try to find ways to please the gods. And so take a god of fertility, for example, a god who's going to bless your crops and bring rain and things like that. You might think, how am I going to make sure this god is happy and pleased? And so you think something like, I'm gonna offer him some of my grapes from my harvest, and I'm gonna bring those to that fertility god. I'm gonna offer it to them, and maybe it seems to work for a little while. You have good crops, it rains, and then eventually you get a down year, and it doesn't rain as much, and your crop isn't as good, and you think, for some reason the god's not happy with what I've been offering anymore. I need to offer more. So maybe not just grapes, you start offering olives, and that seems to work for a while, but then you get some more down years. And again, you think maybe this God isn't satisfied anymore. And what can I offer him instead? And so maybe you continue the grapes and the olives, but now you start offering an animal as a sacrifice. And maybe even like, the firstborn of your animal, something really quality and good. And you offer that as a sacrifice too. And again, it seems to work. The rains come back, the crops are good, your flocks start to flourish, and the God seems to be pleased again. And then you get to another one of those down years, and you think, man, I've offered the best of my crops, I've offered the best of my animals. What else could I offer to show this God that I truly want to please them? And maybe my child. What if I offered my firstborn son? And so they did. That's kind of how the idea of child sacrifice develops around Abraham. It's not just like one day people are sitting around thinking, man, we should probably sacrifice our kids. No, it's a slow, progressive development that reaches a point where now people around in the time of Abraham aren't just offering animals or grapes. They're offering their own children to show the gods that they are serious about pleasing them. And again, this is going on all around Abraham, and Abraham's still trying to figure out what his God is like. And so I think in some ways when God came to Abraham and said, Abraham, I'd like your son, I think Abraham, just based on his reaction, might have been like, yeah, I was kind of expecting that. I'm not that surprised. And so Abraham got up and went, and didn't even really put up a fight. He just went and brought this his son to God. It says that they cut wood for the burnt offering. They walked for 3 days. They told the servants to stay behind, and we're going to bring Isaac up on Mount Moriah in order to sacrifice him. Abraham took the wood that was going to be used for sacrifice, and he put it on Isaac. And Isaac had to carry that up as well as the instruments of death, the knife and the fire. And Isaac asks a really tough question. He says to his dad, the fire, the wood are here. What are we sacrificing? And Abraham, maybe a little bit as a prayer, not just a nice response to his kid, maybe as a prayer, he says, God's going to provide. And he's probably fervently hoping and praying that God will provide some sort of solution instead. But Abraham seems to be willing to go through with this. As we follow along, why don't I read this a little bit for us? It says that they reached the place that God had told them about. Abraham built the altar, he arranged the wood on it, and then he tied up Isaac. Isaac's probably like 13, so Isaac's going to have some self-awareness of what's going on. He knows his dad is tying him up and putting him on an altar, and something's up. And sometimes this whole event is called the binding of Isaac because of this event where he's tying Isaac down to the altar. And so he puts Isaac on top of the wood. And then he reaches out his hand. He's taking the knife. He is actually about to kill his kid. Actually, we usually picture Abraham like stabbing Isaac to death. Probably not, right? Just like a sacrificial animal, Abraham probably has the knife right to the neck of his son Isaac. And suddenly, out of nowhere, God says, Abraham. And Abraham quickly responds, here I am. Right? Don't slit the knife accidentally. Here I am, right? He's probably startled and then stops and responds to God. And God says to him, don't lay a hand on him. Don't do anything to him. Now I know you fear me because you've not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looks up in verse 13, and there in the thicket he sees a ram caught by the horns, which was convenient. I don't know how long that ram was there. He goes over and he takes that ram and he sacrifices it as a burnt offering instead of his son, and he calls that place, the Lord will provide. And it's said, on this mountain the Lord will provide. And then God repeats his promises of land and descendants to Abraham, and Abraham ends up returning home. If you think about a couple things here, if Abraham's still trying to get to know God, and the gods of the culture all around Abraham expect things like this from people, that the gods of the culture expect people to offer up their own children as a sacrifice, God's saying something to Abraham. God's saying something different about himself. God's saying to Abraham, look, I'm not like that. This whole process we went through is to show you I'm not the kind of God that demands your firstborn. In fact, I will provide. I provide you a ram instead. I am not that type of God, and I will never ask you to do something like that, Abraham. I think another thing worth pointing out, if you look at where Mount Moriah is, just above that golden dome, a little bit to the left, maybe someone has to point it out, is a couple small grayish domes. And where those small grayish domes are, that's where Jesus died. Within 1/8 of a mile of this location. And so you have Isaac, who's called Abraham's only son, the one that he loves. And Isaac is carrying the wood that he's going to be sacrificed on up a hill. We can't help but think of the foreshadowing that that's bringing, where one day, instead of Abraham's son having to give up his life on a hill, God's one and only son will carry that wood up a hill and give up his life. We can see some parallels between Abraham and Isaac and God and Jesus. And whether or not Abraham realizes that right now, Abraham gets a little glimpse into what God is going to do. I'm going to move forward. You might have to pause this for a moment. This would be on your paper, some bullet points to summarize the story that we've been talking about. Again, God might be making a statement to Abraham about the type of God that he's going to be. Isaac carried the wood up himself. Abraham bound him to the altar. He was about to sacrifice him. God stopped him. Isaac might be foreshadowing Jesus a bit, but maybe as importantly for Abraham, he knows something different about his God here. Again, if you need to pause it, you can. There's some other references in the New Testament to this moment. I'm going to put these up on the screen. Whoops, show you the summary too quick, but that's okay. Why don't you pause it and read it out loud? What sticks out in this verse? Right? This is part of that heroes of the faith passage. And we see here that Abraham by faith went, even though he didn't know what was going to happen, even though God had made promises to him. And it says that Abraham thought or reasoned that Isaac could be brought back from death. And in some ways it says that he did get Isaac back from death. You should add the little summary at the bottom to your paper before we move on if you need to pause it again. Another verse from James 2 that talks about this. Why don't you pause it and read it out loud? That's kind of a classic passage from James. And it talks about the idea that Abraham's faith and actions were working together in this moment. That his faith was actually made complete by what he did. And it's not that his faith was insufficient or it wasn't enough. It's almost like the word implies that his faith was made full by what he did. In other words, Abraham didn't just know, he did. And by knowing and doing, there was this fullness of a life of faith that he couldn't experience any other way. And you can capture that last bullet on your paper as well. Abraham's faith was working together with his actions, and his faith was made complete by what he did. So a pretty significant story, and another story that points Abraham in the direction of God and points him in a direction toward Jesus. As a PS, I always wonder about the conversation that wasn't recorded. You know, Abraham and Isaac probably had like a 3-day journey to get back home. And I kind of imagine Isaac at some point saying to his dad, Dad, were you really going to kill me? And Abraham probably saying, No, I knew God was going to provide the whole time. But don't tell your mom anyway. But Sarah found out because it got written down eventually. So, Abraham and Isaac. Right, something to think about and reflect on today. If you want to talk about it more in class, that's up to Mrs. Bytework at this point. We'll pause here. We have some other things to work on, and we'll pick up Isaac and Rebecca tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.